I will read for you Captain Underpants and his fifth epic novel in ASMR style for you. RSMR Katz. Hello my little mouses and welcome back to a new ASMR episode here on my YouTube channel. I will read now for you Captain Underpants and the Worst of the Wicked Wedgie Woman. It is the fifth book, so you already can listen to the books before. It absolutely makes sense to start with the first book and work up to the last from this kind of episode, that you're actually always on track of what is happening. If you're not already do, feel free to follow me, to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the notification bell. I am happy over every support, so when you would write a comment, let me know if you already read this book, how you like it and what you think about my ASMR channel here on YouTube. And here is not my only project I have. The World Wide Web is my playground, and that means you can find way more when you search for it. I have headphones in my ears because this is a high quality recording, means actually that you have to put your headphones in as well to listen to the crystal clear sound I produce here, because quality is my biggest kink and I want to show you how amazing the adventure of sound can be. So lean back, relax and enjoy the story of Captain Underpants and the Rest of the Wicked Wedgie Woman, the fifth epic novel by Delph Pilkey, who also actually make the illustration in this book. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Albert Einstein. Hey everybody! Before you read the story, there's some stuff you need to know. Read this comic book to fill yourself in the story so far. But remember, this info is top secret, so don't let it fall into the wrong hands. The trouble with Captain Underpants. Now it can be told. Once upon a time, there were two kids named George and Harold, but they had a mean principal named Mr. Crab. One time, George and Harold hypnotized Mr. Crab with a 3D hypno ring. George and Harold made him think he was a great superhero named Captain Underpants. It was funny at first, but then Mr. Crab jumped out of the window. George and Harold had to chase after him so he wouldn't get killed and hurt. They had many adventures with lots of inappropriate humor. Then, one day, Mr. Crab excitedly drank super juice. Now he got superpowers. He can fly. Two things you have to be careful about is water and finger snaps. If you snap your fingers by Mr. Crab, he turns into Captain Underpants. And if you pour water on Captain Underpants' heads, he turns back into Mr. Crab. So if you see Mr. Crab, don't snap your fingers or you will be sorry. And if you see Captain Underpants, don't pour no water on his head. You will be sorrier. Remember, this is top secret, so don't tell anybody. Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on one right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. At most schools, the teachers try to emphasize the 3 E's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But George and Harold's teachers, Miss Ribble, was more concerned with enforcing what she called the 3 S's. Sit down, shut your pie holes, and stop driving me crazy. Why this was unfortunately for all of her students, it was especially bad for George and Harold, because they were imaginative boys. You see, imagination was not really encouraged at George and Harold's school. In fact, it was discouraged. Imagination would only get you on-way ticket to the principal's office. This was sad for George and Harold, because they didn't get straight as they were in Sparks, and they could barely walk down the hallway without getting into trouble. See what I mean? But George and Harold had one thing that most of the other folks at Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School didn't have: imagination. They were fully of it, and one day they would use that imagination to save the entire human race from being overthrown by a crazy woman with even crazier superpowers. But before I can tell you this story, I have to tell you this. Chapter 2. Miss Ribble's Big News. One fine day, George and Harold's class teacher, Miss Ribble, entered the classroom looking a bit meaner than usual. "All right, settle down," shouted Miss Ribble. "I have some bad news. I'm retiring." "Hooray!" cried the children. "Not today," snapped Mr. Ribble. "At the end of the school year." "Oh, man," moaned the children. "But the staff are throwing a retirement party for me today," said Mrs. Ribble. "Hooray!" cried the children. "During break," said Mrs. Ribble. "Oh, man," moaned the children. "There will be lots of free ice cream," said Mrs. Ribble. "Hooray!" cried the children. "My favorite flavor, chunky tofu," said Mr. Ribble. "Oh, man," moaned the children. "But first," said Miss Ribble, "it's time for something fun." "Hooray!" cried the children. "You all get to make happy retirement cards for me," said Mrs. Ribble. "Oh, man," moaned the children. Chapter 3. When you care enough to send the very best. Mrs. Ribble went around the classroom handing out envelopes, sheets of paper, and butterfly stencils to all of the children. Then she wrote a poem on the chalkboard. "All right, take out your crayons," said Mrs. Ribble harshly. "I want you to use stencils to make a yellow butterfly on the front of your cards. When you're done, copy this poem on in the inside." "Can we make it up our own poems?" asked Melvin neatly. "No," snapped Mrs. Ribble. "Do we have to use stencils?" asked Aaron Mancini. "Yes," yelled Mrs. Ribble. "Can we make our butterflies purple?" asked Stephanie. "No," screamed Mrs. Ribble. "Butterflies are yellow. Everyone knows that." While the rest of the class worked on their cards, George and Harold had a better idea. "Let's make Mrs. Ribble a comic book instead," said George. "Oh yeah," said Harold. "We can make it all about her. It will be cool." So that's just what they did. Chapter 4. Captain Underpants and the Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman. Once upon a time, there was a really mean teacher named Mrs. Ribble who was very, very mean. She gave us lots of homework and yelled at us all the time. One time at Christmas vacation, she gave everybody 41 book reports. Wake up! It's your time to open your present. I can't. I have to do my homework. After Christmas, everybody turned in a big pile of book reports. Then something terrible happened. Mrs. Ribble was buried in a mountain of book reports. She's really most seriously dead. No, she isn't. We can rebuild her, said the doctor. We can make her better than she was. Faster, stronger, evil. When Miss Ribble got out of the hospital, she had bionic powers. I will take over the world. So she made the evil costume. Her bionic behave hairdo opened up to reveal the evil Veg Roboclaw. Help! Veggie Woman is in the teacher's lounge. She just drank all the coffee and now she's giving the gym teacher a killer veggie. Oh, the horror. She better make a fresh pot. This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. What's the problem? Help! It's Wedgie Woman. So Captain Underpants got into a big fight with Wedgie Woman. She tried to give him a veggie, but Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than a boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. So Wedgie Woman went to the shop to buy some spray starch. Wedgie Woman sprayed. Oh no, my underpant is all stiff and uncomfortable. Captain Underpants tried to push the buttons on his utility waistband, but they were broke. He was powerful. I am doomed. Wedgie Woman gave Captain Underpants a bit veggie. Then she hung him from a pole. Soon some kids came by. Captain Underpants needs our help, so they threw him a rope. Then they pulled real hard and let go. The kids poured fabric softener in a pool. Suddenly, starch got washed away. Hooray! My underpants is soft and cottony ends again. Thanks, kids. No problem. Soon Captain Underpants found Wedgie Woman. Remember me? Get him, Roboclaw. He flew up and looped around. The Roboclaw reached for underwear, but it grabbed the wrong pair. It's off to jail with you. Tra-la-la-la. Hooray! Notice, any similarities to actual persons, living or dead, is very, very unfortunate. Chapter 5. The Wrath of Mrs. Ribble. When Mrs. Ribble read the comic book that George and Harold had made, she was furious. "Boys," she yelled, "you've just earned yourself a one-way ticket to the principal's office." "But all we did was our imagination," said George. "You are not allowed to do that in one school," snapped Mrs. Ribble. "Didn't you read chapter 1? George and Harold gathered their things, and soon they were sitting in the office outside Mr. Crubb's doors. "Mr. Crubb is on the phone," said the school secretary, Miss Antrophy. "Why don't you boys make yourself useful and copy the Friday memo for me? You can pass them out to all the classrooms for me while I go to lunch." "Oh man," said George. "Quiet your whining buster," shouted Miss Antrophy. I want this done by the time I get back, or you will both be sorry. Miss Antrophy grabbed her coat and stomped out of the door. George and Harold looked at the Friday memo. It was a weekly newsletter that told all about the events of the upcoming week. Hey, said George, Miss Antrophy's computer is still on. You want to make a few changes to this newsletter? Why not, said Harold. Suddenly, Harold got a sneaky idea. He took out the blank piece of paper that Miss Ribble had given him earlier. Hey, Miss Crubb, said Harold, will you sign this retirement card for our teacher? Mr. Crubb grabbed the card from Harold and eyed it suspiciously. His card is blank, Mr. Crubb growled. I know, said Harold. Our class is going to decorate it later. We wanted you to be the first to sign it. Well, all right then, said Mr. Crubb. He opened the card and quickly scribbled, signed Mr. Crubb, on the inside. Then stormed out of the office. What are you going to do with that? Asked George. You will see, said Harold, smiling. Chapter 7. Reverse Psychology. George and Harold passed out the Friday memo and made it back to their classroom just in time for Mrs. Ribble's retirement party. George quickly changed the letters around the sign outside the door, while Harold wrote a special greeting on Mrs. Crubb's card and stuffed it into the envelope. Hey, Babs, shouted Mr. Crubb as he stormed down the hall. What do you kids think you're doing? We're going to Miss Ribble's retirement party, said George. That's what you think, smart guy, said Mr. Crubb. Mr. Crubb showed me that comic book and you boys made about her. And now I catch you changing the letters around on another sign. You boys aren't going to any party. You're going straight to the detainment room. Well, fine, said Harold. Then we are not going to give Mrs. Ribble the card our class made for her. Mr. Crubb quickly swept the card off the Harold's hand. Ha, he shouted. I'm going to make sure she gets this card. I'm going to give it to her myself. Oh man, said Harold. George and Harold walked down the hallway towards the detainment room. Wow, said George, that was pretty cool. How you got Mrs. Crubb to deliver the phone card for you? Yep, said Harold. I used reverse psychology on him. I've got to try that sometime, said George. By the way, what did you write in the card? You will see, said Harold, smiling. Chapter 8. The Party. Mrs. Ribble's retirement party started off bad and just got worse. First, Miss Ribble forced the class to sing a corny song to her. By the time she was done yelling at the boys for singing off-key, the chunky toffee ice cream was melted. Everybody had to eat it anyway. Then, the children handed in their happy retirement cards. Mrs. Ribble ripped several of the cards up because some of the children had mistakenly drawn polka dots on their butterflies. One unfortunate boy had also drawn a happy smiling sunshine on his card, and he had to stand in the corner. Finally, Mrs. Crubb stepped forward and handed Mrs. Ribble the card he had snatched from Harold's hand. I went to a lot of trouble to get this for you, Mrs. Crubb said gallantly. Mrs. Ribble tore the envelope open and read the card out loud. "You're one-hat mama," says Mrs. Ribble, with a shocked look in her face. "Ooh," cried the children. She opened the card and read the inside. "Will you marry me? Signed, Mr. Crubb." "Ew," cried the children. The teachers gasped. Then the room grew silent. Mrs. Ribble glared over at Mr. Crubb, who had turned red and begun sweatingly profusely. He tried to speak. He tried to tell her it was all a big mistake. He tried to say something, but all that came out of his congratulations, said Mr. Mina as he patted Mr. Crubb's sweetly shivering shoulder. Yes, congratulations, shouted Miss Antrophy. This will be the best wedding in the whole world. We can have it here at school, a week from Saturday. I plan everything. You lovebirds don't have to worry about a thing. Great, said Mrs. Ribble, still looking quite angry and confused. What? Said Mr. Crubb. Chapter 9. Freaky Weeky. The following week at Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School was definitely one of the weirdest ones they'd had in a while. For example, none of the kids showed up for school on Monday, but Mr. Crubb didn't even seem to notice. Hey, where's everybody today? He asked misdirected. Said Mr. Crubb. One Tuesday, everybody did show up in their pajamas. Why is everybody picking their nose? Asked Miss Fit. Said Mr. Crubb. One Wednesday, for some strange reason, the whole school smelled like garlic and rotten egg salad sandwiches, especially some of the girls. Boy, said Mrs. Guided, the styles today sure are getting bizarre. Said Mr. Crubb. Thursday was without a doubt a complete and total disaster. There's a food fight in the lounge room, shouted Mr. Roseworthy, and the football team is destroying the teacher's lounge. Said Mr. Crubb. Now, nobody was sure what happened on Friday. Apparently, there was a mix-up with the dress code on the yearbook photos. Our school pictures are ruined, shouted Mr. Durkin. Said Mr. Crubb. Yet, it was Freaky Week, all right, but the big wedding was only a day away, and things were about to get really, really freaky. Chapter 10. The Big Wedding. It was Saturday, the day of the big wedding. Miss Antrophy, true to her word, had taken care of everything. In just 1 week, she had transformed the gymnasium into a beautiful wedding hall, completely with food, decoration, and even 2-meter-tall ice sculptures. All of the children were dressed in their finest clothes. Harold even wore a tie. Man, said George, I can't believe we have to go to school on Saturday. I know, said Harold. Why couldn't they have had this wedding during Monday's math test? Soon, the organist began to play. The rabbi walked down the alley. He approached George and Harold and stopped to talk to the boys. I've heard a lot about you too, said the rabbi, and I don't want you boys playing any of your tricks today. Silly rabbis, thought George. Tricks are for kids. Believe it or not, George and Harold had not planned any pranks for the big wedding. They had no joy buzzers up their sleeves, no squirting flowers in their laps, and no whoopee cushions on their chairs. They were on the best behavior. Nothing could go wrong today. In no time at all, Mrs. Ribble and Mr. Crubb were standing in front of the rabbi, looking quite ill. The rabbi asked Mr. Crubb if he would take Mrs. Ribble to be his lawfully Wedgie wife. Said Mr. Crubb. Then the rabbi asked Mrs. Ribble if she would take Mr. Crubb to her husband. There was a long silence. Everyone leaned forward. Mrs. Ribble looked nervously from side to side. Suddenly she shouted out at the top of her lungs, "No!" Mrs. Ribble turned to Mr. Crubb and jabbed her finger into his shoulder. "Listen, Crubb," she said, "I can't marry you." Hooray! Oh, that's too bad, said Mr. Crab. You're a man, cruel and vicious man, said Mrs. Ribble, and I respect that. It's just... Just what? Asked Mr. Crab. It's just your nose, said Mrs. Ribble. You got the most ridiculous nose. I've never seen anything quite like it. I just couldn't marry somebody with such a silly nose. Mr. Crab got angry. Well, fine, he shouted. I didn't want to marry you anyway. It was all George and Harold's fault. They tricked us. Suddenly, everybody in the gymnasium turned and looked at George and Harold. Time to go, said George. Chapter 11. The Refreshments. As George and Harold turned to leave the gymnasium, they heard the loud thumps of studded wedging boots clomping down the aisle towards them. I'm gonna grind this kid into head cheese, screamed Mrs. Ribble as she lunged for the two boys. George and Harold screamed and ran to the back of the room near the refreshments. There, they hid behind two large wooden pillars. Mrs. Ribble approached the pillars and grasped them with her mighty hands. With a horrible roar, she pushed the right pillar over. It landed on the back of the luncheon table, causing the front of the table to flop high into the air. Unfortunately, this sent all of the food flying into the crowd. The creamy candy carrot clobbered the kindergartners. The fatty fried fish flipped on the first graders. The sweet and sour spaghetti squash splattered the second graders. 3,000 sawing thimbleberries shooted the third graders. 500 frosted fudgy fruitcake flocked the fourth graders. And 55 fistful of fancy French fried frankfurters flanked the fifth graders. By now, you're probably worried that the wedding guests had nothing to drink with a lovely appetizer. Well, rest assured, the second pillar took care of that. Miss Ribble pushed the left pillar into the fresh fruit display, causing it to topple over, sending two large watermelons crashing down into the two oversized punch bowls. This created two enormous splashes of tropical fruit-flavored punch, which rained down upon the wedding guests like a torrential downpour. Now, no wedding is completely without a wedding cake. And when Mrs. Ribble kicked the ice sculpture over, the resulting crush sent the beautiful double-decorated cake flipping high into the air, right over Mrs. Ribble's head. I've got you now, screamed Mrs. Ribble, as she grabbed George and Harold by the neck. Splash! George and Harold undid their ties and ran out of the gymnasium screaming. Man, cried Harold, I thought we were dead meat. That's what we get for going to school on Saturday, said George. Chapter 12. Ribble's Revenge. As you might imagine, George and Harold were nervous about going back to class one day. But for some strange reason, Mrs. Ribble seemed happy to see them. Good morning, boys, Mrs. Ribble chipped with a giant evil toothy grin. Come here. I've got something to show you. Said George. He's smiling. That can't be good. George and Harold cautiously approached Mrs. Ribble's desk. I took the liberty of adjusting your grades last weekend, said Mrs. Ribble. You'll be happy to know that all your grades have just dropped from B and C to F's and G's. Oh no, George gasped. Not F and G's. Hey, what's a G? It's the only grade lower than F, said Mrs. Ribble. There's no such grade as G, said Harold. There is now, said Mrs. Ribble. Looks like you're both going to flunk the fourth grade. Won't that be fun? No way, said George. That's not fair. Life ain't fair, said Mrs. Ribble. Get used to it. Chapter 13. A Bad Idea. That afternoon, George and Harold sat in their tree house, feeling sorry for themselves. She can't get away with that, said George. We got to tell somebody about this. Nobody's going to believe us, said Harold. Well, there's one thing we can do, said George. He opened the drawer to their drawing table and searched through pennies, paper, clips, dried spitballs, and rubber bands. Then he pulled out a dusty plastic ring with some gum stick on it. It was the 3D Hypno ring. Oh no, said Harold. I thought we threw that thing away. We just threw the introduction away, said George. But I remember how it works. Do you remember? What happened to the last time we used it? Asked Harold. Yeah, said George, but we were fooling around last time. This time we'll be serious. We won't make any mistakes. All we have to do is hypnotize her into changing our guards back to normal. That's all. I don't know, said Harold. It sounds like a bad idea to me. Worse than flunking the 4th grade? Asked George. Good point, said Harold. Chapter 14. The Return of the 3D Hypno ring. The next day at school, George and Harold stayed behind while the rest of the class went outside for a break. What are you punks still doing here? Asked Mrs. Ribble. Said George nervously. We want to show you this really cool ring. Yeah, said Harold. If you look closely at it, you can see a funny picture. Well, hold it still, said Mrs. Ribble as she started to ring it intensely. I have to move it back and forth, said George. Or you want to be able to see the picture. Mrs. Ribble's eyes followed the ring back and forth. Back and forth. Back and forth. You are getting sleepy, said George. Very sleepy, said Harold. Mrs. Ribble yawned. Her eyes began to drop. I'm so sleepy, she said, as she slowly closed her eyes. In a moment, said George, I will snap my fingers. Then you will be hypnotized. Sleepy, mumbled Mrs. Ribble. Now, said Harold, you must listen very. Chapter 14 and a half. We interrupt this chapter to bring you this important message. Hello, this is Chim Chim, dear parents. This is Ingrid Ashley reporting for Eyewitness News. We have a lot of breaking story about a tragic incident that is now occurring in the Pacific Northwest. Police have just closed down the Lee Wisely Guide Novelty Company in Valhalla, Washington. Apparently, this company has been selling very dangerous hypno rings. We know that take you live via satellite to our reporter, Boogie Lasery Several with the latest developments. Thanks, Jim Jim, said Larry. Reports have poured in from all across the country concerning children who have used the 3D Hypno ring on their friends and family with the disastrous result. But the most shocking revolution in the effect that the ring seemed to have in women. Apparently, whenever the ring is used to hypnotize a woman, a mental blunder occurs, causing the woman to do the opposite of what she is being hypnotized to do. Doctors don't know why the ring causes women to have an opposite reaction, but they are very concerned. If you are someone you love has purchased a 3D Hypno ring, throw it away at once, and whatever you do, please don't use it on a woman. We now return to our regular scheduled chapter, already in progress. And when we snap our fingers, George continued, You will change our grades back to normal. Yeah, said Mrs. Harold. And you won't do anything crazy like turn into Wedgie woman. And you won't try to destroy Captain Underpants, said George, or taken over the world either, right? Said Harold. You'll just change our grades, and that's it. George and Harold looked nervously at each other. Well, said George, I think that covers everything. Yup, said Harold. We shouldn't have any more problems from Mrs. Ribble. So the boys snapped their fingers. Chapter 15. Bad Hair Night. That night, Harold and George camped out in George's treehouse. I have to drive your mother to work early tomorrow, said George's dad. So you boys are responsible for getting yourselves to school one time. Okay, Pop, said George. We'll be there. And early. It had been a tough day for George and Harold, and now it was time to relax. George rolled out the sleeping bags while Harold unpacked a box of chocolate, donuts, 4 cans of orange cream soda, and a big bowl of barbecue potato crisps. Believe it or not, there was even a cool Japanese monster movie playing on TV. You know, said George, life doesn't get any better than this. Yep, said Harold. But do you think the Hypno ring actually worked on Mrs. Ribble? She looked a little weird when she came out of her trance. She was probably just sleepy, said George. Teachers have very stressful jobs, you know. I wonder why, said Harold. After the movie, George and Harold brushed the crumbs out of their sleeping bags and got ready for bed. Let's sleep in our school clothes tonight, said George, that we won't have to wake up early to get dressed. Good idea, said Harold. So George turned out the light, and soon the 2 boys were drifting off to sleep. After a few minutes, Harold sat up quickly and looked around. Hey, he whispered. What's that noise? I didn't hear everything, said George. They listened closely. Shh, said Harold. There is it again. George heard it this time. He reached over and opened the treehouse door a crack. All they could hear was the sound of crickets chirping in the night. George opened the door wider, and the boys peeked down. Whoa! roared an evil-looking woman dressed in tight purple velour and many-looking fake fur boa. George and Harold screamed in horror. The snarling woman climbed from the ladder into the treehouse. George and Harold recognized her immediately in the moonlight. Mrs. Ribble, George gasped. What a lovely outfit you have on. Who's Mrs. Ribble? The angry lady growled. My name is Wedgie, woman. George and Harold looked at each other and swallowed hard. I understand that you boys have information about Captain Underpants, said Wedgie woman. What makes you say that? Asked Harold. I've read your comic books, said the evil villain. You boys know his strengths, his weakness, and I bet you even know his secret identity. No way, said George. Captain Underpants isn't real. He's just a cartoon. Well, we will see about that, Wedgie woman scoffed. Wedgie woman reached out and grasped George in Harold's arms. What do we do now? Cried Harold. We can take her, said George. It's not like she has superpowers or anything. Chapter 16. Who is afraid of the big bad behave? The struggle that followed may someday be remembered as the single most unlucky thing that ever happened in the history of the world. First, George pulled his arm out of Wedgie woman's grasp. Then, Harold screamed away too. When Wedgie woman lunged after them, George crouched down into a ball behind Wedgie woman's feet. All it took was a simple knock from Harold to send Fenrir's female toppling over backwards. Right into the wall. Clunk! The bookshelf aboard Wedgie Woman had shook violently, causing a strange-looking juice carton to topple over. Suddenly, a stream of glowing green juice poured out of the carton, directly into the tightly woven behavior of her atop Wedgie Woman's head. "No," yelled Harold as he grabbed the juice carton. "This is the juice we got from the spaceship back in our third book." "You mean the one with the unusually long title?" asked George. "Yeah," said Harold. "This is extra strength superpower juice, and a whole bunch of it got in her hair now." "Don't worry," said George. "None of it got in her mouth. What the worst thing that could happen? Her hairstyle would have superpowers." "Well," said Harold, "I guess you're right. That's pretty stupid, even for one of our story. It's pretty funny, so." Suddenly, the two coiled arms of twisting hair shot off Wedgie Woman's head and grabbed George and Harold by the back of their underwear, yanking them high into the air. "You know," said George, "this isn't as funny I thought it would be." Chapter 17. All tied up. Wedgie Woman brought George and Harold back to her house and tied the boys tightly to the chairs. "Tell me the secret identity of Captain Underpants," screamed Wedgie Woman. "No way," said George. Said Wedgie Woman. "You want to do this the hard way? No problem." Wedgie Woman's hair began uncoiling itself. Several twist looks of her hair stretched out into the living room and started taking apart the television, the computer, and the sidemaster. Other tangled coils reached into the kitchen and began dismantling the dishwasher, the toaster, and the food processor. "What are you doing?" asked Harold. "If you want to make robots," said Wedgie Woman, "you gotta break a few small appliances." George and Harold watched intently while Wedgie Woman's hair assembled thousands of assorted screws, balls, wires, gears, cartridge tubes, and computer chips. Soon, two small robots began taking shape. "I didn't know Mrs. Ribble was smart enough to make robots," said Harold. "Me neither," said George. "I think some of the extra strength superpower juice must have soaked into her brain." The next morning, Wedgie Woman completed her robots, which she named Robot George and the Harold 2000. "You know," said Harold, "something about those robots seem a little familiar." "Yeah," said George. "They kinda look like us, only as dashing handsome." Wedgie Woman opened the robot's chest plates and inserted a can of spray starch into each one. Then she sealed the chest plates, patted each robot on the head, and sent them both off to school. "Captain Underpants doesn't stand a chance now," Wedgie Woman laughed. "Wait a minute," said Harold. "How are those two robots going to stop Captain Underpants?" "All they have to do is wait and listen," said Wedgie Woman. "And as soon as they hear the words, tra-la-la-la, it all be over." Chapter 18. Robot George and the Harold 2000. "Ooh, attention, boys and girls," said Mrs. Crubb to the fourth graders. "Your teacher, Mrs. Ribble, didn't come to school today." "Hooray!" shouted the children. "Settle down," Mr. Crubb shouted. "You are still going to have all your classes." "Oh man," moaned the children. "But you're going to have substitute teacher," said Mr. Crubb. "Hooray!" shouted the children. "And it's going to be me," said Mr. Crubb. "Oh man," moaned the children. The whole day was pretty much like a normal day. except for one thing. Mr. Crab couldn't understand why George and Harold were so well behaved. They didn't make funny noises during science class. They didn't stick craisins up their noses during art class. And they didn't draw comic books during math class. In fact, they even walked past the sign without changing the letters around. Mr. Crab was stunned. "All right, you two," Mr. Crab shouted. "I know you're up to something. You better stop being so good or you're gonna be in big trouble." But Robert George and the Herald 2000 kept right on behaving. The only time they did something even remotely wrong was during break. Everybody was playing kickball, and when it was the Herald 2000 turn to kick the ball, he kicked it pretty damn hard. Ka-boing! The kickball tore right through the top of page 101 and out of the other side as it sailed towards the outer regions of Earth's atmosphere. Soon it broke free of our planet's gravitational pull-in and began heading straight towards the planet Uranus. "Ah!" shouted Mr. Crab as he pulled out the officer's school rule book and read rule number 411. "It is against the rules to kick school property into outer space. You're in trouble now." But the Herald 2000 ignored Mr. Crab and began running around the base. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Hutchins," Mr. Crab shouted. He pointed at Harold 2000 and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, Mr. Crab began to change. A silly-looking smile stretched across his face, and he stood before the fourth graders looking quite heroic. Quickly, he turned and ran back into the school. Chapter 19. Tra-la-la-la, lunatics. Several minutes later, Captain Underpants flew out of Mr. Crab's office window. As the hero zipped across the sky, he let out a triumphant tra-la-la-la. When Robert George and the Herald 2000 heard the words, they immediately stopped playing kickball. Suddenly, their arms began to extend and their legs stretched toward the sky. Staged secret campaigns in their ever-growing torsos opened up, revealing giant rocket boosters and the latest in advanced addiction technology. Steel panels on their faces and bodies expanded widely as the complex structures swelled to highly improvable proportions. Suddenly, flames shot out of their retrotrus as their bodies rose into the air. In no time at all, the two giant robots were flying in hot pursuit of amazing Captain Underpants. "George and Harold are in big trouble now," said Melvin neatly as he read rule number 7000 of Mr. Crab's official school rule book out loud. "It is against the rule for students to transform into giant flying robots during afternoon break." The real George and Harold, however, had more on their minds at the moment than a few broken rules. They watched the action unfold on a big screen television that Wedgie woman's horrible hair had built by combining the spare parts of a fish tank and electric toothbrush. The colossal robots surrounded Captain Underpants, but surprisingly, the waistband warrior looked happy to see them. "George, Harold," said Captain Underpants, "may how you boys have grown. And I didn't know you could fly. That's great. Now you can help me fight for truth, justice, and all that is free, shrunk, and cottony." But the giant robot didn't respond. Instead, they however closed the Captain Underpants as their steel chest plates opened up. Suddenly, two extendable robotic arms reached out and began showering Captain Underpants with liquid spray starch. What are you doing?" cried Captain Underpants. "That's spray starch. It's the only thing in the world that can take away my superpowers." The waistband warrior screamed in horror as he began falling through the sky. Rob George quickly swooped down, grabbed the helpless hero, and hung him by his waistband on a tall pole high above the city streets. Chapter 20. You're axed for it. Hooray! Cried Wedgie Woman as she turned off her new TV. My plan worked. Now it's time to take over the world. But what about us? Asked Harold. Don't worry, said Wedgie Woman. I've got a big surprise for you two. She took a heavy battle axe and tied it up with rope. Then she leaned the axe towards George and Harold and lit a candle under the rope. When the flame burns through the rope, said Mrs. Wedgie Woman, all your problems will be over. Get the point? Not really, said George. Don't worry, laughed Wedgie Woman. You will soon enough. Wedgie Woman laughed horrible laugh. Then she dashed out of the door to take on the world. George and Harold watched as the flame began burning through the rope. They cringed as the impending dome of the axe blade came closer and closer. Well, said George, it looks like this is the end. Maybe not, said Harold. Maybe the blade will fall unsliced through our ropes and not harm us at all. I doubt it, said George. That kind of thing only happens in real lame adventure stories. Suddenly, the blade fell in slices through the ropes, not harming George or Harold at all. The two boys looked at each other and decided it was best not to comment on the situation. Chapter 21. The houseless weaving of the wicked Wedgie Woman. Wedgie Woman headed to the center of town to meet up with Robot George and the Herald 2000. Well done, my previous robot, said Wedgie Woman affably. What's all this then? Said the policeman who just arrived on the scene. Nothing, officer, said Wedgie Woman. Just the beginning of my total world domination. Oh, okay, said the cop. Hey, wait a minute. But before the police officer could voice his objects, a twisted dreadlock from Wedgie Woman had shot out and grabbed the cop by the back of his underwear. The colossal Herald 2000 lifted the officer and hung him from a stop sign. Oh, whoa, cried the cop. Soon, more police officers headed to the scene, but they all met with the same terrible fate as the first policeman. Before long, every cop in the city was hanging from a street sign. Call the National Guard, screamed the chief of police. Call the army, call the marines, call a hairstylist. Soon, the armed forces arrived with a whole fleet of tanks and helicopters. But everybody was afraid to shoot. Wedgie Woman was just too quick. The giant robot stomped around the city as Wedgie Woman barked out her commands. Everybody on Earth must obey me, cried the wicked Wedgie Woman. If anybody refused, they will get the wedge. If anybody tries to stop me, it's Wedgie time. Bow down to me, or welcome to Wedgie Village. Soon, George and Harold arrived at the scene. They hid in some bushes and watched the terror unfold. We've got to rescue Captain Underpants, whispered George. He's the only one who can save the world. But how? Whispered Harold. He's got no superpowers left. Sure he does, said George. Starch doesn't really take away superpowers. He just thinks it does. We've got to change his mind. I sure hope we can, said Harold. Chapter 22. They can't. George and Harold ran to the pole where the heartbroken hero was hanging. Hey, Captain Underpants, cried Harold. You've got to come down from there and save the city. I can't, whined the waistband warrior. Need fabric softener? No, you don't need fabric softener, said George sternly. That was the dumb joke in one of our comics. But you don't understand, said Captain Underpants. Starch is the enemy of underwear. Only fabric softener can save me. Rats, said Harold in frustration. Hey, George, are there any shops around here? Yeah, said George. A new one just opened down the street. Then let's go buy some fabric softener, said Harold. It'd be easier than trying to reason with the guy. How's that going to help? Asked George. It's all in his mind, Harold explained. If he believes that fabric softener will save him, then it probably will. I think it's called the placently effect. So George and Harold ran to the street. What's the name of the shop? Asked Harold. I can't remember, said George. I think it's called Everything Effect. Oh man, we're doomed, cried Harold. Listen, said George. We've got to make another comic book. Now? Asked Harold. It's our only hope, said George. The fate of the entire planet is in our hands. So the two boys bought some paper and a few pencils and get down to work. 22 minutes later, George and Harold had created an all-new Captain Underpants adventure. They ran back to the pole where Captain Underpants was hanging and tossed their new comic up to him. This is not time to reading comics, said Captain Underpants. Just read it, said Harold. Yeah, said George. You might learn something. Chapter 23. The Origin of Captain Underpants. A far time ago, in a galaxy long away, there was a planet called Underpanty World. Underpanty World was a peaceful planet where everybody wore only underwear. Everybody liked wearing underwear so much that they never got into fights and they didn't have no wars either. It was cool. But one day, all of it happens ended abruptly. The Wedgie warlords had arrived. Hey boss, let's spray that planet with starch. Okay, I hate those guys. The good people of Underpanty World got scared. So they ran to their leader, Big Daddy Long Johns. Hey boss Big Daddy. Don't worry, I have a magic amulet that will protect us from starch. But they excitedly dropped the magic amulet. It fell into the mouth of his newborn son, little baby Underpants. Oh no, he swallowed it. We are doomed. Just then, the Wedgie warlord sprayed starch on the Underpanty World. Big Daddy Long Johns and his lovely wife, Princess Pantyhouse, knew that their plan was a goner, so they decided to save their baby. So they stretched his underwear real far. Then they let go and shot him into space. Little baby Underpants sailed through space as home planet crumbled behind him. Soon, little baby Underpants fall to Earth. Little baby got adopted by some old guys. They named him Captain after their favorite cereal. But as the years went by, Captain became very sad. For some strange reason, he never ever seemed to fit in. Then, one night, he had a weird dream. He saw his old planet and his old parents. Son, you aren't like our other people. You are a superhero. Also, you have a majesty amulet inside you. It will protect you from the evils of the stars. All you have to do is say these words. I summon the power of Underpanty World, and you will overcome the powers of stars. So Captain awoke up and became a cool superhero guy. And he never had to be as scared of starch no more. Even Wedgie Woman's robot spray with him, because all he had to do was say, I assume the power of Underpanty World, and he would be free. Well, whatever you're waiting for, just say the words. Chapter 24. The Placenta Effect. Wow, said Captain Underpants. I didn't realize that I had power within me all along to overcome the evils of starch. Just say the words, shouted Harold. Okay, said Captain Underpants, but I think it's great a metaphor for just say the words. Captain Underpants grabbed the giant robo-arms, swung them around. Oh. All right, said Captain Underpants, but all I'm saying is that. Just say the words, screamed George and Harold. You know, said Captain Underpants, you cats have no feel for dramatic tension. Then he cleared his throat and spoke in a powerful voice. I summon the power of Underpanty World. Suddenly, Captain Underpants rose triumphantly in the air. He was free at least. When the giant robot saw the Captain Underpants had escaped, the Herald 2000 launched its rocket arms out hero. Captain Underpants grabbed the giant robo-arms and swung them around toward his toes. Those might come in handy, said Wasteland Warrior. Chapter 25. The Incredible Graphic. Violence Chapter in Flipporama. Warning. The following chapter contains scenes that are so violent and naughty you aren't allowed to view them. We are not kidding. Do not read the following chapter. Don't even look at it. Just skip ahead to page 156 and don't ask any questions. P.S. Don't breathe in or out. Roughen up the Robo George. Horrible hurting the Herald 2000. Let's put our heads together. The Super Smashy Cyber Slam. Chapter 26. Reverse Psychology 2. The giant robots were defeated, but the battle was not over yet. Harold ran back to their treehouse to grab the 3D Hypno ring, while George ran back to everything except fabric softener for some more supplies. Soon, George returned to the center of town, carrying a big cardboard box filled with spray cans. What are you doing with that? Asked Harold, who had just arrived with the 3D Hypno ring. I'm taking this extra strength spray starch someplace where Wedgie woman won't be able to find it. Extra strength spray stash, cried the wicked Wedgie woman. That's just what I needed. Her winding hair lashed out at George, stopping him dead in his tracks. Then 9 twisting braids each grabbed a can from the box and began spraying them at Captain Underpants. A huge cloud of mist filled the air, covering everything in sight and making these 2 pages incredibly easy to draw. When the cloud finally lifted, all of Wedgie Woman's hair was gone. In fact, all of everybody's hair was gone. See, George explained, there was no spray starch in his box. This box was just a clever disgusting cartoon of a hair remover. I used reverse psychology on her. Ah, screamed Harold as he clutched his bald head. My mom's gonna lay hard-boiled egg when she sees me. Relax, said George. Our hair will grow back. That's easy for you to say, said Harold. Your hair was only a few centimeters long. Reverse psychology, chapter 27. Well, Wedgie Woman, said Captain Underpants, it's off to jail with you. Wait a second, said Harold. We take care of Wedgie Woman. You go back to school, put some clothes on, then wash your face. Yeah, Bob, said George. Use plenty of water. We got work to do. Okay, said Captain Underpants. So Captain Underpants did as he was told, and in no time at all he was back to his grumpy old self. It was now time to transform Wedgie Woman back to her old self too, with some slight modification. Okay, said Harold. Remember when we hypnotized Mrs. Ribble and she did the opposite of everything we wanted her to do? Yeah, said George. Well, if we want to set things right, Harold continued, we've got to hypnotize her into doing the opposite of what we want. I'm way ahead of you, said George. So, the two boys once again hypnotized their teacher. Only this time they used reverse psychology on her. From now on, said George, you will always be known as Wedgie Woman. You will keep all your superpowers too, said Harold. You will not go back to teaching 4th grade, said George. You will remember everything that happened in the last 2 weeks, said Harold. You will not change our grades back to normal. You will not become the nicest teacher in the history of Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School. And you will not bake fresh chocolate chip cookies for class every day. George, said Hadley sternly, stop goofing around. I can't help it, said George. You should never hypnotize anyone when you're hungry. Oh, okay, said Harold. Let's just snap our fingers and pray that this works. Chapter 28. To make a long story short, it did. Chapter 29. Better living through hypnosis. The next day, Mrs. Ribble entered the classroom looking a whole lot friendlier than usual. Boys and girls, said Mrs. Ribble, I have some good news for you. Hooray, cried the children. It's time for English class. Oh man, moaned the children. Today, said Mrs. Ribble, I've asked George and Harold to lead the class. Hooray, cried the children. They're going to teach us about creative writing, said Mrs. Ribble. Oh, ma'am, moaned the children. By showing us how to make our own comics books, said Mrs. Ribble. Hooray, cried the children. While they're doing that, said Mrs. Ribble, I am going to pass out something for you all. Oh, man, moaned children. Homemade chocolate chip cookies, said Mrs. Ribble. Hooray, cried the children. This is awesome, said Harold. But do you think it is right for us to change her personality like we did? Sure, why not, said George. She's happier. She probably live longer. You're right, said Harold. I guess hypnotize is pretty cool thing sometimes. Then, again, as well know, sometimes it isn't. Were this cookie hard to make? No, dear. They were snapped. Oh no, screamed Harold. We go again, screamed George. Tra-la-la-la. And this was the 5th book, Captain Underpants and the Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman. If you liked this episode, then write a comment down and let me know what especially you liked about the book. And I would be amazed if you just follow me everywhere in the World Wide Web. My name is ASMR Katz, and the World Wide Web is my playground. So if you are curious right now, you can find way more about me here and everywhere. So feel free to search for it. I am a tattoo girl who take you on the adventure of sound. And if you are also in other ASMR stuff, then feel free to check out all my playlists. I also make food ASMR, go on the adventure of sound, enjoy very personal and philosophical ASMRs, and the best of it, it's always in the highest quality. I always take the best amount of care to give you a high quality experience here on my ASMR channel. Feel free to follow me, to subscribe, to click on the notification bell, because I will try to upload as much as possible videos for your ASMR needs. And I would be amazed about every support I get to let all the hard projects I do grow, and also my ASMR YouTube channel. So thank you so much for listening, and if you not already did listen to the other 4 books from Captain Underpants, then I will recommend you to do so. Just click through my playlist and listen to them all.